floor is yours.
Okay, so hello. Thank you, Lars, so very much for introducing me. And I promised my research group at Constance to say hello. So hello, greetings from, from Oxford. Hopefully you're watching me, I don't know, and not sitting in the coffee shop, yeah. But I don't think so. So it's a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to give a talk on experience sampling. For me, this topic is very important. I work with experience sampling now about more than 10 years, and I'm still very fascinated of this method. So it's a pleasure to talk about this method today. And this presentation is strongly based on a recent book chapter, which will be published soon. And the co-authors of this chapter are Madeleine Beek, it's one of my colleagues at the University of Constance, and Nathan Hall from McGill University. So the title of this presentation is Assessing Academic Emotions via Experience Sampling Methods. So concerning experience sampling methods, these methods seem to be very important. There are numerous studies since the 1970s, but very few of those studies have assessed academic emotions. And the main assumption for assessing academic emotions via experience sampling is that retrospective reports are not very valid. Meaning that when you say how you generally feel about, for example, visiting such seminars, you would think about how do you typically feel when watching presentations and hearing presentations, and your cognitions will play a very important role when answering to the so-called droid questions. How do you normally typically feel? So it seems to be strongly biased by subjective beliefs, stereotypes, cognitions. So retrospective reports might not be very valid, and there are other effects like peak effects. You first of all remember very intensive feelings, so you seem to overestimate your habitual emotions. So the idea is to ask people how they feel here and now via experience sampling. And here is an example from teachers which we investigated. It's a very small sample, pre-study with 34 teachers. So we asked teachers, how do you generally feel when teaching in your class? This is the droid assessment. And we assessed enjoyment, pride, shame, anxiety, anger, boredom with a classical droid questionnaire. And additionally, we gave teachers PDAs, and they gave a randomized signal while they were teaching. And they really stopped teaching for about 30 seconds, which was nice for the students, or not, I don't know. So they stopped teaching and answered immediately on the screen how they feel here and now. So we did this for a couple of weeks, and then we built an average score across all of the state assessments. And the wording of the items, this is very important to note, was very similar. It was a parallel wording for droid and state assessment, so the values can be compared. And what you can see, that the droid values are much higher than the state values for all emotions, for positive and negative. So when teachers report their enjoyment is 4.06, the real enjoyment is 2.81. So there's a huge difference how you assess academic emotions. So first important point is, beyond and above this idea that state assessments might be more valid, that most of our theories on academic emotions are on the intra-individual level. That is saying when a person has specific cognitions, then this person should have specific emotions. Like Reinhardt's control value theory is strongly based on an intra-individual basis. But empirical results in the whole field of psychology are more than 90% on inter-individual relations. And this is a strong mismatch. And concerning academic emotions, there is also this very strong mismatch that nearly all of our studies on academic emotions are trace-based. That is, we can only do inter-individual analysis, but we would have to do intra-individual relations to investigate in order to see whether the theories work. So actually, what is the experience sampling method? It's defined as a method of data collection in which sampling procedures gather self-report data repeatedly during real-world experience so as to provide real-time data as opposed to retrospective reports on individuals' perceptions. And sometimes experience sampling is parallel worded to ecological momentary assessment or ambulatory assessment. So from the terms, there is not so much of a difference. So a typical experience sampling study would be when I would ask you, at this moment I'm experiencing boredom. from 1 to 5. And maybe I would ask you several times during this seminar, and at the end maybe I have 6 assessments from each of you. I will build an average score of the 6 assessments, showing me how much you were bored during this seminar. Maybe we can include it in your evaluation. But not on boredom, just an enjoyment. And then I could also ask you at the end of this seminar, how much boredom did you feel during this seminar as a trade assessment? And I'm sure that there would not be much convergence of both types of assessments. So it's something very different. Also concerning the definition of experience sampling is that there are 3 different types of experience sampling. The first one is interval contingent, meaning that the assessments are pre-designated, for example, an assessment every hour or every day. The second one is event contingent, so the events are pre-designated. For example, there are assessments at school, at math classes or at German classes. The third one is signal contingent. This is randomly timed signaling, so the signal will occur randomized. It's important to note that it is possible to combine the 3 types of sampling. For example, you can do a signal contingent assessment within a specific class, for example in math classes. So the idea would be just to ask students to activate the PDAs at the beginning of each math class, so this would be event contingent, and then a randomized signal will occur within maybe the next 45 minutes. So this would be randomized. This would be a combination of event and signal contingent. Let's come to some practical aspects. The first, which is very important, is the sample size and the number of assessments. So how many subjects do we have to investigate and how many assessments within our subjects? So this strongly depends of course on the research question. Is the research question first of all an intra or inter-individual one? So if it is an inter-individual one, the number of subjects is the most important number, and is the research question an intra-individual one, the number of assessment is very important. Concerning the calculation of the number of subjects and assessments, it's recommended to just do a power analysis. Our experience, and this is a very raw rule of thumb, is that you should have at least 30 persons with 10 assessments for each person. The second important practical aspect is how to deal with missing data. Experience sampling is still a self-reporting method, so you can refer to the classical literature. But what is very specific for experience sampling, that we have very different sources for missing data. One source is just the inability to provide a response. A second source would be just to ignore the signal. So in order to know what type of missing data you have in your data, it's important to ask participants. For example, in the next assessment to ask, why did you not respond to the last questions on the PDA? And there should be a number of options. The next practical aspect is the hardware and the software. You can do experience sampling with just a paper and pencil version or very highly sophisticated technical methods. Depending on a number of questions, it's important to decide what hardware and software you want to use for experience sampling. So it depends, for example, on the sample size, on the age, on the type of sampling. But what is also, for example, very important, if you want to combine your experience sampling assessment with physiological data, you need, for example, equipment which can transfer the data from your physiological assessment tool to the other assessment tool, so that you have a combination of both. And here on this next slide you can see that there are a lot of possibilities concerning the hardware and the software, and this is just a selection of even more options. And what is very important is that, of course, there is a fit between software and hardware. But at the beginning, maybe 10-15 years ago, when I started with experience sampling, we had a really hard time to have a good hardware and software, and also we had a lot of problems. But now it's rather easy to do experience sampling. There are a lot of apps, for example, which are rather easy just to use. A further highly important practical aspect is the use of items and scales. So experience sampling is a self-report, so generally modified available self-report scales can be used for the assessment. For example, items from the Academic Emotions Questionnaire developed by Reinhard Pikrun. A highly important question is, should we use single items or multi-item scales for the experience sampling assessment? Long scales take longer to complete and they might compromise the assessment. So, for example, when you ask how do you feel here and now and you ask 20 questions about your emotions, you might report how you feel during answer to all of these questions rather than how you feel, for example, in this moment, what would be actually related to the classroom. But concerning single items, which would be preferable, the question arises, what's about the reliability? There is the problem when you have, for example, a lot of variance within persons. Is it due to real variance or is it just due to a low reliability of the measures? So what we do in our experience sampling studies is mainly to use two items. And if you use two items, you can calculate the reliability, but it are of course very short scales. A further question is, what exactly type of questions do you give to your participants? One example would be, at this moment I'm experiencing enjoyment. Another opportunity would be, how much enjoyment are you experiencing during this math class? Concerning the second question, it's a bit generalized, but it's clearly related to the math class. Concerning the first question, it's real life assessment and a state assessment. At this moment, I'm experiencing enjoyment. However, it might be that when the student answers to this question, that the emotion of enjoyment is not related to the math classroom. It might be that the student was just looking out of the window, seeing something funny thing outside and experiencing a lot of enjoyment, which is clearly unrelated to the classroom. So it strongly depends on the research question, what specific type of items you use. The next practical aspect is related to statistical methods for analyzing experience sampling data. Generally, experience sampling refers to multi-level structures, and these multi-level structures have to be taken into account using software like HLM or N+. You normally have measures within persons, and then you have persons within classes, and sometimes classes within schools, and so on. Concerning the specific method of analyzing experience sampling data, it's possible to use hierarchical linear regression, structural equation modeling, time series analysis, or spectral analysis. It's important to note for time series analysis that there is still no software available which you could use for data which are not equidistant in nature. However, there are ways maybe to analyze such data with time series analysis in the future, because people are working on the development of such programs, which would be very, very, very helpful for future research. So let's come to some examples of experience sampling studies. One is one of our study, which is entitled, Do Girls Really Experience More Anxiety in Mathematics? In two studies, namely one related to test anxiety and the second related to classroom-related anxiety, we investigated both state anxiety and trait anxiety. And our hypothesis would be that there would be strong gender differences in the report of trait math anxiety. That is, girls should report higher levels of trait anxiety, but our second assumption was that the level of state anxiety should be the same for boys and girls. The reason for this assumption was that reports of trait anxiety can be assumed to be strongly impacted by our subjective beliefs. And a very important subjective belief is academic self-concept. So we know that girls have lower academic self-concept in mathematics. Also, they have the same grades as boys. So our expectation was that girls would overestimate their anxiety in the trait assessment, but in the state assessment, the level of anxiety should be the same as those for boys. And in fact, we found this result that girls and boys reported the same levels of state anxiety, but they differed in the reports of trait anxiety, with girls clearly reporting higher levels. Here is another study published 2013. We did a state assessment on different domains, event, contingent, and randomly assessed within different domains in math, physics, German, and English. And for the state assessment, so I'm typically, my main research topic is boredom, so I was not too disappointed that the highest level for all emotions were reported for boredom in all academic domains, followed by enjoyment, pride, anger, anxiety. But what you can see is that there is not much difference in the different emotions with respect to the different domains. So it's a very similar pattern. And now we ask really the same question in the trait assessment, and this is now the same scale, but you see much higher levels in all domains in the trait assessment. And what is very interesting, that here are in fact differences with respect to the domain. So in math and physics, students report much more anxiety as compared to the language domains, but we don't find this difference in the state assessment. So this seems also to be related to subjective beliefs and what we think about emotions. So the trait assessment seems to be more than what we think, how we are feeling, and the state assessment more what we actually feel. A next investigation showing the importance of experience sampling is, let's go to boredom, a very fascinating emotion. When we have here the circumflex model, here for the valence from positive to negative, and here the arousal from calm to fidgety. Boredom is typically located here. So with low arousal and slightly negative feeling. What we did with experience sampling, we asked students, high school students and university students during class instruction, but also in the afternoon in leisure time, whether they experience boredom here and now. And when they experience at least a little amount of boredom, we ask our participants, how does it feel to be bored in this moment? And then they could answer from positive to negative, on a 5-point scale, and from calm to fidgety. And what we found, that in a lot of assessments, participants answered it is a positive feeling to be bored. And sometimes it was very negative. And based on this assessment, I cannot go in details, we found that there are different types of boredom. So indifferent, calibrating, searching, reactant, and apathetic boredom. And the interesting thing is, when you build a mean score across all of these boredom types, you in fact find this artificial boredom like you can find it in the literature. So when I started with my boredom research, I was a little bit frustrated because the results were so heterogeneous. Some people write, yeah, it can enhance creativity, it can be a very positive thing. There is literature saying, oh, it's very detrimental. On average, studies find it goes in line with negative achievement levels. And there is this ongoing discussion, can boredom foster creativity? And our results based on experience sampling would say it depends on the type of boredom. When you experience reactant or apathetic boredom, you get creativity, but here maybe this might induce creativity. So in this field, experience sampling can maybe lead to further studies investigating some constructs in more detail. A last example is we investigated the relation between goals and academic emotions in an experience sampling approach. There was a theory, but just one detail. Performance approach and performance avoidance, those two constructs related to goals, correlated the trait assessment 0.86 in the study. We did a trait and state assessment, and this is a typical result. And we think that both types of goals cannot really clearly be separated. But in the state assessment, the correlation was only 0.48. So correlations based on assessments within persons or intra-individual relations strongly differ in their meaning from inter-individual relations. So the meaning is, for the state assessment, when you experience, for example, high levels of anxiety, at the same time you will not experience high levels of enjoyment. It's nearly impossible. But in the trait assessment, when you have high scores on both assessments, on both emotions, it might say sometimes I experience a lot of enjoyment, sometimes a lot of anxiety, so you find maybe a high correlation on the inter-individual level, but this does not mean that you experience both emotions at the same time. And so you can solve this problem just by doing experience sampling studies. So the strength, high ecological validity of experience sampling data allows within-person processes, and it can contribute to the call for the use of multiple methodologies. However, there are also a lot of big challenges related to experience sampling for academic emotions. First, we have the self-selection bias. I mean, what people agree, for example, to participate for half a year, to answer every day how they feel. So we might have very motivated people. So decreasing data quality, maybe after a specific period of time, people won't answer the questions very seriously. There is a recent study showing when you give people these paper and pencil questionnaires for a state assessment, some people just at the end of the assessment, they take 2 hours and complete all of the state assessment. They should have completed real time. So when the assessment period is too long, this might be a strong decrease in the quality. ESM is an intervention. For example, when you ask permanently, how do you feel at this moment, and you do this for half a year, you might maybe foster your metacognitions on emotions, and your it might have an impact what you are feeling. When you realize after two weeks, I'm permanently bored, maybe you change your whole life due to experience sampling, and so it's an intervention. Experience sampling still, but you can use a control group to see for a shorter period of time to see whether there are effects of experience sampling. Experience sampling remains a self-report, so it's not too bad to add these supplemental measures like physiological parameters, or what we hear today in this seminar. And the data collection is relatively intensive. So it's important to select, to really focus on very specific variables. So and this is my final slide. Potential direction for future ESM research. I think more ESM studies would be important to explore academic emotions, because very most of our existing studies are based on trait assessments. So it might contribute to our current picture on the structure, antecedents, and effects of academic emotions. Then it would be important to develop short ESM measures. So my impression is around the whole world where people work on state academic emotions, they have their own measures. They just use specific items, 1 or 2, but they are not really comparable. So to have maybe experience sampling state questionnaire for academic emotions would be very helpful and not too difficult to develop. So using ESM to contrast intra and inter-individual findings, I talked about this, combining this with other assessment methods. And I think what would be very fascinating, and maybe this seminar could be a starting point of such a network, is to build an international network of researchers assessing academic emotions via ESM, and maybe relate this network to other networks focusing on other methods. So I think this would be very helpful. My impression is that people working with ESM on academic emotions are still largely unconnected. So this would be very, very important, and I would be very happy if something in this direction could develop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thomas. We have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. And there is also the opportunity for our webinar people to text questions to Jake, and he will then read them aloud for the speaker. But let's start with you, questions to Thomas. Comments, queries?
Thank you, Thomas. That was a really good talk. Earlier you talked about an example of anxiety, and you said somebody might be doing a math equation and then they get a text in, how anxious are you feeling? Could the fact that intervention comes in the middle of an equation actually turn on anxiety? Could it make someone more anxious because they've just been reminded how anxious are you? And how do you deal with that?
Yes, that's a very interesting point. When we think, are you anxious at this moment? Oh, when you think about yes. So it's important that you talk to students to answer immediately, not to think about it, just to report how you feel. This is very important. And this actually is the way we would like to combine it with physiological measures. And then you would see it when you read the question, does your arousal increase? Just by asking the question. So this is a very important thing. But it might also be vice versa, that while you are working on a math test, that you are completely not aware of your emotions because you are so strongly focused. This is a highly important point and calls for combining it with physiological measures. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, first,
thanks for this excellent presentation, Thomas. I mean, one of the promises of ESM research and similar methods is making it possible to do intra-individual analysis of the psychological functions. Now that typically is not possible, as you pointed out, because it's random sampling of events and the intervals cannot be compared across participants. Do you know of any ESM research that really tackled this issue in having equal intervals across participants, and how was that done? I mean, that, for example, that would imply that if it's a classroom, that all students are filling in the ESM ratings at the same point of time. So has somebody done that? Is there experience with that?
I don't know. I know not one single study doing this. It could be very important. I mean, the problem in the classroom is when we do experience sampling, we have not more than 3 or 4 students within one class, because when it gives a randomized signal, it's disturbing. So you cannot do it for 30 students at the same time. And this is a problem, of course. If you would do it, it would give the same signal immediately for all students. I don't know of one of these studies, but I think it would be important. The problem is when you do it equidistant that you change the subject domains from measurement to measurement, that you change completely the situation. So it's a big problem. I don't know about such studies, but would be surely very helpful to do it.
Just as a brief comment to that, Manuel Völkle in Max Planck Institute in Berlin is working on time series methodologies for both equidistant and non-equidistant time series data, and he will be a speaker at our 3rd seminar. So there is work in progress on the statistical methodologies for this question. And Susie?
Thank you. It's a slightly maybe more philosophical question, but what do you think are the implications of your research? Because you mentioned about decision making and how it might be more related to the trait, emotional sort of reports. So how do you see this being used in the future, or in an academic context, for example? Do you know the differences?
Yes, there are a few studies showing that our thinking about emotions and our belief system is largely responsible for decision making. So it's a very constructive point of view. How you perceive the world will determine how you react in this world, of course. And experience sampling seems to be more related to real-world emotions, what you currently feel. So I think when we assess state emotions versus trait emotions, both types are important, but for the trait emotions, they might more strongly be related to our other belief systems, and decision-making is also a belief system. So just to give you one example, we did a recent study on teacher emotions, and what we found is that teachers who report that they are emotionally exhausted strongly overestimated their negative trait emotions, but not their state emotions, but not their positive emotions. This is very important. So when teachers think they are emotionally exhausted, they also think they have higher negative emotions, and this might lead to dropout and such things. So it's always within our belief system, but the emotional exhaustion has only an impact on negative emotions. So it seems to be within the negative belief system. So it's a lot about belief systems in people.
I was thinking, because one of the strengths, as you said, is to the investigation of within-person processes. But I'm also very interested in within-person processes relating to features of the event, of the situation. And are there examples of using maybe two items, one asking about a feature of the event, is this difficult? Or how difficult is this? And then emotion, or that kind of relating a feature of the situation or the event with a state.
Very important question, yes. We published a paper 2014 exactly on this aspect. We asked students not just about their emotions, but also how the teacher is at this moment teaching, how enthusiastic the teacher is, how structured is what he's talking, how clear it is to students, and then we related the perception of the teaching quality to the emotions, and there were very clear relations between teaching and emotions. So this is a very important point to have it not just to assess emotion, but also the social environment. But actually what is related to this point is the problem that we cannot conclude on causal relationships. It might also be that when students are very happy, they perceive their teacher as being more enthusiastic. So we cannot really conclude on causality. This is sometimes a misunderstanding experience sampling, or sometimes makes it not possible to make causal relations. Otherwise, you use really this time series analysis or specific analysis where you need specific data. But it's not, normally it's not an experimental design.